In his new book, Odessa, Genius and Death in a City of Dreams, author and historian Charles King explores the history of Odessa and how it rose to become the center of Jewish life and ultimately the scene of horrific destruction. Charles King is also a professor of international affairs and government at Georgetown University, and he joins us now in our studio. Welcome.
Thanks very much.
So tell us what attracted you to Odessa.
Well, I've spent a lot of time traveling around the Black Sea over the last 20 years or so. I'd written books about the Black Sea, about Moldova, about the Caucasus, but I'd never had a chance to delve into the most important urban center around the sea, if you don't count Istanbul, which technically isn't on the sea at all. And Odessa had always attracted me as a kind of place. I'd visited many times, and I had seen, I think, over the last 20 years, the transformation of the city itself from being a kind of run-down post-Soviet port in the early 1990s to being today a place that has rediscovered its own heritage, rediscovered its own identity, and that has kind of embraced its cosmopolitan heritage. And in a part of the world where the nation, that is the ethnically defined nation, is still kind of the primary unit of loyalty for many people, Odessa stands out as a kind of variegated and multicultural and cosmopolitan space, in some ways a kind of beacon for the entire region.
So you talked about being impressed today about Odessa, but you also wrote about what Mark Twain felt about Odessa when he visited in the 19th century. Can you tell us about his impressions back in 1860?
That's right. Well, he was visiting the 1860s as part of the world's first kind of long-distance pleasure cruise that ended up going to what we would now call the Middle East, to portions of the Ottoman Empire, to portions of the Russian Empire. He ended up meeting the Tsar in the day, and he traveled to Odessa. And when he got to the top of the Odessa steps, he kind of looked around at the port, looked around at the city lying inland, and he said, when he looked around himself, all he saw was America. That is, he was so impressed by the fact that the streets in the old city of Odessa meet at right angles, that you have these long boulevards, that it seemed to be a city on the move, a place of commerce and with lots of different kinds of people of different religions moving about in this urban space. So it reminded him really of an American city of the day. But he was seeing the city kind of at its height, at the height of the thing that really drove the economy in that era, and that's the grain trade, particularly the overseas trade in wheat. So in some ways, Twain was visiting at the golden age of Odessa, but right at the beginning of its decline.
We talk about Odessa at that point being a multicultural city. Can you tell us about the different ethnic groups that lived there?
Well, when he was there, the city was very, very multicultural. Russians, Ukrainians, still a very strong Italian and Greek presence, which had been even stronger at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. And also at that stage, the city was already about a quarter Jewish. So it was already a major center of Jewish life and culture and art, and that figure would rise to being about a third Jewish by the time of the Second World War.
And how did life for Jews differ in Odessa than it did in the Pale of Settlement in other parts of Eastern Europe?
Well, Odessa was formerly part of the Pale, but it was very different from other cities that were in it. It was a place where Jews could be successful, where they could engage in commerce, engage in overseas trade relatively easily, where they could move about relatively freely. And it was also a place where they could in some ways escape all of the strictures that define Jewish life in other parts of the Pale of Settlement. Not only the restrictions placed on Jews by the Tsarist government of the day, but also the traditions of old-style Judaism, of the dominance of religious life and religious teaching that might have existed in other villages and towns and cities within the Pale. Odessa was a fundamentally new city, and it was a place where Jews, like Russians and Ukrainians, Italians, and others, would go to reinvent themselves.
So were the actual laws in Odessa different than they were in other parts of the Pale?
Well, this is the beauty of Odessa. The laws might have been the same, but they were applied in a looser kind of way. And in fact, that became part of Odessa's of identity, really. It was a place where you could skirt the law, either to make money or to engage in revolutionary activity or whatever. But it's also a place where the more loosely applied restrictive laws allowed all sorts of communities to flourish.
So let's talk about this golden age in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Who are some of the more prominent figures to emerge from Odessa?
Well, in fact, if you take a kind of snapshot of the city in the middle of the 1890s, around about the time of Odessa's centenary, founded in the middle of the 1790s, so it was 100 years old at the end of the 19th century, you have this sort of who's who of major characters in Russian and Ukrainian and Jewish culture. People like Anna Akhmatova, who was christened there, the person who would become Anna Akhmatova. Isaac Babel, the great Russian Jewish writer, being born around that time, and a whole string of others who contributed to Russian literature and art, to Yiddish language and culture, and most spectacularly, a person I cover in the book, someone I see as one of the major representatives of Odessa in this period, Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was a major figure in the history of Zionism, but a character that's not often covered in Zionist history today.
So some of the roots of thinking about returning to Palestine were born in Odessa then?
That's right. I mean, certainly Odessa played host to a whole range of Zionist leaders. What's interesting about Jabotinsky, though, is that his version of Zionism is essentially a kind of Jewish nationalism. That is to say, he doesn't see anything unique in the idea of a Jewish homeland. In fact, he's surrounded by groups, whether they were Italians or Greeks or Poles or Ukrainians in Odessa in that period, who were also seeking their own independent or fully sovereign homelands. And he thought, well, why shouldn't Jews in Odessa be exactly the same? Secondly, he was a right-wing Zionist. He was opposed to the socialist wing of Zionism, who saw sort of the history of Zionism as being inextricably linked to the history of the left political movement, the Marxist political movement in the Russian Empire. He rejected that and felt that, in fact, a very tough form of Zionism would be the brand that would ultimately win out. And in fact, I think over time, that version of Zionism after the late 1940s became much more prominent in Israel.
So you talked about the left. Trotsky also had his beginnings in Odessa. Can you tell us about him?
Yeah, so Trotsky was schooled in Odessa very, very early on. He attended the St. Paul's School in Odessa. And in fact, of course, once he was ejected from the early Soviet Union, Odessa was the last port that he saw as he began his exile, first in Istanbul and then later abroad. What is interesting about Trotsky to me is that he says in his memoirs that he learned everything he needed to know about being a revolutionary from St. Paul's School in Odessa. He learned what conspiracy was like. He learned what it was like to stand up to political authority, and in that case, the authority of the teachers in the school. And he learned how to organize what he called the great vacillating mass of humanity. That is, the people, in his day, the schoolboys, who weren't either for the teachers or for the kids who were being disruptive, but vacillating kind of in between. And you needed, in other words, a kind of vanguard party of school kids to organize them.
So it seemed like at that time, Odessa had wealth from being a port and the grains. It also had arts and culture, and it also had a loosening of laws. Is that what you see as the key ingredients for it being so successful at this time?
Yeah, I think that's it. The thing I would add is, of course, the international context, because this is an era in roughly from the 1850s to the 1890s when Odessa is exporting so much to the rest of the world. I mean, the plains of Ukraine become literally the breadbasket of the world, where grain and barley and wheat and other things are shipped from this major port to the Mediterranean and then on to other parts of the world. That's the kind of golden thread that runs through Odessa's history at its height. And as things begin to decline internationally, as the Suez Canal opens and allows trade to move in a slightly different direction, as new sources of grain become available, particularly in the American Midwest and in Canada, Odessa's role begins to decline. And in fact, you can then trace the economic decline of the city from that point and by extension, the kind of cultural and social decline of the city.
So we talked about the genius. I guess we're getting into the death now. We look at things like pogroms and attacks on Jews, specifically in Odessa. When did that start to really rise? Was it connected directly to the grain prices falling?
Well, the idea of a pogrom in Odessa was almost an annual occurrence from the 1860s or 70s forward. In fact, the memoirists who wrote about their period in Odessa during that time say that, this is something that tends to happen. Some rough ups or riots involving particularly Christian boys and Jewish boys in Odessa in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s is something that tends to be a normal occurrence. What is different about a couple of important episodes at the beginning of the 1870s, in 1881, and then in 1905, is that these are of a scale that Odessa hasn't seen previously. In part, I think it has to do with the shifting kind of social character of the city as more peasants are moving in from the countryside, attracted by the growth in the grain trade. They find themselves kind of in competition with local Jews for jobs and access to economic resources. That creates a very volatile environment. But as the 19th century progresses, it's also Jews themselves who get tired of being beaten up every spring around Easter, and they begin to form self-defense units. So that by the time you get to 1905, the largest pogrom up to that time ever in the history of the Russian Empire, it becomes so deadly, so volatile, precisely because that's the time the Jews fight back. In fact, in the spring and summer and fall of 1905, you get something close to a mini civil war in Odessa.
And it's connected to the spring. Is this because during Easter there's, I guess, the falsehood of Jews, eating Christian babies or something like that? Why was it connected to that time of year?
Well, that was always the case around Easter when you would have the confluence often of Easter and Passover as holidays in both of those communities. It was also, yes, a time when at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, this awful myth of Jews somehow making matzah from the blood of Christian babies became very widespread in the Russian Empire. And so that becomes a sort of focus of myth-making and then also of violence. The other thing about 1905 that was different from before is you have lots of soldiers with guns hanging out in the city because Odessa was a major mobilization point as Russia was fighting the Russo-Japanese War. And so that entire mix creates an incredibly volatile environment, and Jews, by and large, are the victims.
Well, then right after 1905, or soon after, we should say, is the First World War. What does that do to transform Odessa?
Well, the First World War period in Odessa is extremely complicated because you have a whole series of occupations. An effective French occupation, a kind of British occupation. There's an American warship that comes through. You also have multiple Ukrainian governments who assert control over the city. But by 1919, the group that is very clearly in charge is the Bolsheviks. As they push down toward the coast of the Black Sea, eventually, of course, conquering Crimea, the last redoubt of the White Russian forces north of the Black Sea, the city and the surrounding territory come under Bolshevik control. And it's from that period then that you have a period of kind of red terror with Bolshevik forces sweeping up any remnants of the white forces that might remain or Ukrainian nationalists that might remain.
At what point do the people in Odessa start to get wind of Nazism and the rise of Hitler?
Well, this is also a complicated and tragic point in Odessa's history because Odessa is very much on the front line in the confrontation between Hitler and Stalin. But that confrontation only begins, of course, in the summer of 1941. Up to that point, Odessa had been on the front line not of a contest between enemies, but in fact a cooperative relationship between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. So suddenly, when there's an invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi and Allied forces, and in Odessa's case, it's important to emphasize the Allies because it's the Romanians who are in control during the wartime period, not the Nazis. That's when Odessa, I think, experiences its darkest moments.
Well, you're writing, though, that some of the Jews of Odessa fled before the war really came to them, but others held out. Was there a sense we have to get out of here? At what point did the population really decide to decline, to flee, to say this is not a place where life is really going to be thriving anymore.
Well, it was difficult, of course, in that era to make clear decisions about these things. I mean, do you leave your home and the life that you've known to be a refugee in another part of the Soviet Union? And the Soviets organized a massive evacuation effort once the Nazi invasion began. About two-thirds of Odessa's total population, and somewhere around, as best we can estimate, two-thirds of the Jewish population as well, fled in that evacuation effort. But other families chose to remain. They thought it was better to stay in their house and deal with whatever would come rather than become refugees, as far afield as Central Asia. And others of them simply couldn't leave. They didn't have an evacuation ticket. They couldn't get aboard one of the transport ships that was leaving, or one of the trains that was leaving, and they were forced to stay behind.
When we talk about the decimation of the entire Soviet Union, the numbers are sometimes hard to comprehend. 30 million Soviets dying. What did it do specifically to Odessa? How decimated was it at the end of the war?
Well, it was a period of incredible destruction for the Jewish community in Odessa, I have to say. For the city itself was damaged at the beginning of the occupation in the fall of 1941, damaged again as the Red Army came back through in the spring of 1944. The port was very heavily damaged, for example. But by and large, most of the rest of the city was in pretty good shape when it comes to the kind of infrastructure of the city. But the social structure of Odessa changes profoundly. The Jewish population goes from somewhere around 70,000 people or so when the Romanians take control of the city in the fall of 1941 to, as best I can estimate, 48 people by the spring.
Just 48 people.
Not 48,000, 48 Jews in the city. And probably most of those were not even from Odessa. They'd been brought in from the outside to work as laborers or artisans for the Romanian occupation forces. It's one of the most complete destructions of a Jewish community one can imagine. Now, I should say not all of those people, probably not even a majority of those people were killed, but they either fled the city when the Romanians came in, or they were deported by the Romanians to work camps, ghettos, and other facilities in the Romanian-occupied zone of Ukraine.
And you talk about Odessa then during the Soviet era really kind of crumbling, I guess. There were a couple of decades there before the fall of communism where it just kind of, I guess, hobbled along?
Well, I think what happens after 1945 is that in a way, as I write in the book, nostalgia comes to replace actual memory. That is to say, it's from 1945 that the real myth of Odessa begins to develop. There had long been a myth about Odessa as this kind of happy-go-lucky place where everyone is a musician and there's this mix of Italian, Gypsy, Romanian, Greek, Russian, Ukrainian, Jewish culture all creating a kind of Odessan identity of jokesters and hams and so on. But it's after 1945 that nostalgic image of the city really comes into play, in part because the memory of what actually happened during the war was so horrific.
But then you said today there's a new type of Odessa. What's fueling the economy now? What's really the engine for Odessa in the present?
Well, Odessa has come back in the sense that I think it's become a very important summer destination for many Russians and Ukrainians. It's a Ukrainian majority city for the first time in its entire history, even though most of those Ukrainians who live in Odessa are also Russian-speaking, and so it has a very Russian-speaking, Russian cultural flavor to the place. But it's not particularly important as an economic center around the Black Sea anymore. The major port facilities have gone elsewhere. The major shipping centers have gone elsewhere. And what we're left with, I think, is a city that is trying to understand its past, trying to market its past, and in some ways, though, that effort itself is to the good, because the version of its past that Odessans are trying to market is that cosmopolitan one.
How does Odessa serve as a model for the rest of the region in terms of dealing with multiple ethnicities and having people live together and not necessarily coming together as one nationality, but many different nationalities.
Well, many Odessans even today will say, my nationality is Odessan. That is to say, they have this kind of loyalty to the city, above and beyond everything else, beyond religion, beyond ethnicity, beyond nation state, and so forth. And that's the most optimistic reading, I think, of Odessa's past, that it is a kind of model of what happens when you allow a kind of natural genius to emerge out of all of the religions and ethnic groups and cultures that interacted in this very remarkable port city. The dark side of that, unfortunately, is that it's not easy. It takes work. It actually takes a lot of work to be cosmopolitan and multicultural. It takes work to live next to people who speak differently from the way you do and cook foods that you don't care for and whose religion you don't quite get. And I think Odessa's history shows the genius that can emerge when that system does work, but the real tragedy that results when we stop working at it.
So for Americans who can't make it to the Ukraine, how similar or what remnants of the Odessa of the past are in Little Odessa when you go to Brooklyn and you see many people who, are second or third generation Odessans?
Well, I think it is possible to get at least a tiny flavor of Odessa if you go to Brighton Beach in Brooklyn, the so-called Little Odessa by the sea. It's a place that was the target of immigration beginning in the 1970s, not just from Odessa but from other Black Sea ports and other parts of the Soviet Union. And I think there you'd get some flavor of the kind of mixed multicultural heritage of Odessa. You also get to see a kind of city by the sea that has also in some ways been in decline for some time. It's certainly not as good as going to the real thing, but it's not a bad introductory course.
And cheaper.
And cheaper, that's right.
So ultimately, I guess a lot of lessons to take away from the history of Odessa, seeing where things work together, where things don't work. But are you optimistic about the future of Odessa?
Well, I'm optimistic about the future of the city. I mean, I think it is a city that's on its way back. It's become, as I said, a very popular kind of tourist destination. I think more and more people from the Black Sea region are going there and discovering the city. I think more Odessans than ever are traveling abroad and discovering other parts of Europe and other parts of the world and of the Middle East and so on. So I think this multicultural heritage is one that's likely to become even more important in the life of the city. The trick, though, is to be proud of one's past while at the same time kind of really exploring those dark spots. It's all too often too easy, I think, to trumpet one's cosmopolitan heritage without understanding the dark thread that also runs through the same history.
Charles King is a professor of international affairs and government at Georgetown University. His new book is called Odessa, Genius and Death in a City of Dreams. Charles King, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.